Asserting central dominion, this opening immediately begins shaping the board's spatial battle. Developing the knight immediately contests central influence and prepares for kingside expansion. Developing this knight efficiently prepares for castling and supports a central pawn advance. Embracing the fianchetto, black prepares to anchor a powerful bishop on the long diagonal, immediately contesting central influence. Solidifying central control, this advance immediately challenges black's fianchetto setup by creating dynamic pawn tension. Developing the bishop to g7 now prepares to castle and pressures the central pawns. Pioneering space on the kingside prepares for fianchetto, aiming for a solid, harmonious development. Challenging the center's pawn structure immediately opens lines, potentially for a dynamic middle game struggle. Fortifying the kingside structure after solidifying the center's influence, preparing for a potential queenside expansion or central pawn push. Unleashing the queen for immediate pressure, this bold sortie disrupts the pawn structure and seeks active piece play. Seeking to consolidate the pawn center and create a robust kingside defense, white calmly repositions the bishop, forcing black's queen to make another decision while preparing development of the remaining pieces for a central battle. Retreating the queen to this square aims to sidestep the bishop's gaze while maintaining pressure on the queenside pawn chain, though it surrenders some central activity and might leave the queen vulnerable to further harassment if white centralizes their pieces effectively. Capitalizing on the queen's awkward placement, white seizes central space and aims to exploit the pin on the b-pawn, disrupting black's coordination and opening the door for a potential kingside initiative. Recapturing the pawn with the queen opens lines but also exposes her, inviting further pressure and potentially creating awkward defensive duties for black's other pieces as white consolidates their central advantage and targets the undefended pawns. Instead of focusing on a quick pawn grab, white's queen now exerts pressure along the third rank, preparing to potentially exploit weaknesses on the queen side or simply unpinning the knight. This repositioning also helps to defend the d4 pawn indirectly. Brave knight venturing into enemy territory, hoping to disrupt the queenside structure, but it risks isolation if the pawn on c5 isn't adequately supported. Securing the bishop's retreat path and preparing a knight maneuver to challenge black's queenside space seems a sensible way to build pressure. The queen's diagonal dance forces white's bishop to retreat, disrupting its potential central influence and creating a slight tempo gain for black's forces as they continue to develop and eye potential weaknesses. Solidifying the knight's square while preparing to centralize it, this move gracefully sidesteps the immediate queen attack and aims to build a robust pawn structure, potentially leading to a more comfortable middle game fight. Re-establishing a knight outpost on the central square, this repositioning prepares for further skirmishes and potentially pressures white's queen or c4 pawn should it advance. Securing the monarch's safety unlocks queenside expansion and prepares for potential central pawn pushes, a vital defensive maneuver to resist black's active piece placement. Initiating a strategic pawn push to disrupt white's central control and potentially open lines for development seems to be the idea behind this knight maneuver, aiming to reclaim lost territory and contest key squares. Opening the central files for future rook activity, this placement aims to exert pressure along the d-file while simultaneously preparing to bolster the queenside defense if black chooses to attack there, offering a flexible and proactive stance. Seeking to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially exploit the somewhat exposed d1 rook, black initiates a knight maneuver, aiming to occupy a more active square and challenge the d4 and c5 pawns. This move injects a welcome dose of dynamism into the position, forcing white to carefully consider their response and potentially leading to an opening of lines that could benefit either side. The knight repositions, aiming to secure the weak d4 square and prepare a potential advance to e3, shoring up the kingside's structural integrity. Liberating the queen's rook pawn from its defensive burden, this knight exchange aims to disrupt white's central pawn structure and potentially open lines for your own pieces, though it concedes the bishop pair and introduces a potentially isolated d Pawn for black should white recapture with the c-pawn. Reclaiming the knight opens up the d-file for your rook and prepares to challenge black's potentially exposed king, while also solidifying your central pawn structure and reinforcing the e3 square. Initiating castling solidifies the king's safety behind a pawn shield, a crucial step after a somewhat airy development by black. However, it's worth considering the potential impact on the kingside defense should white manage to establish activity along the g-file or exploit the semi-open h-file after a subsequent pawn push. Asserting control over the open c-file is paramount here, as it promises to pierce through black's relatively passive setup and potentially destabilize their queenside pawn structure. Boldly challenging the newly established queenside pawn mass, this move aims to disrupt white's spatial advantage and create immediate counterplay along the b-file, potentially forcing concessions or developing black's pieces into more active positions. Unleashing a knight to a central outpost, white aims to disrupt black's queenside stability and potentially probe for weaknesses around the king. The rook's repositioning to e8 ushers in a more robust defensive posture, anticipating potential threats along the e-file and freeing up the d8 square for enhanced knight mobility. Solidifying central influence and preparing for pawn advances, this move elegantly reigns in the d4 pawn and hints at future kingside expansion, while also potentially offering a safe haven for the knight. Unlocking the c-file is the immediate strategic goal, finally creating a clear path for the rook to join the central skirmish and pressure white's potentially exposed queen's bishop. A strategic shift unfolds as white redirects a knight to a central outpost, initiating a battle for initiative on the kingside and aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Black aims to mobilize the bishop from its passive diagonal, seeking active participation in the unfolding central and queenside struggle, potentially preparing for a queenside expansion or a tactical skirmish involving the d5 knight. This maneuver on the queen, shifting it to a more active diagonal and eyeing the queenside pawns, seeks to exploit any lingering weaknesses after black's recent castling. Exchanging queens here simplifies the position drastically, potentially leading towards an endgame where the pawn structure becomes paramount. Recapturing with the knight establishes a well-centralized piece, poised to exert pressure on the d6 pawn and potentially leap into the more active e4 square, while simultaneously securing the c3 square from any immediate threats. This maneuver avoids the premature pawn push on c5, which could have isolated the queen's flank, and instead opts for a solidifying regrouping that bolsters white's control over the center. The resulting pawn structure will likely lead to a positional struggle, where piece activity and coordination will be paramount. Black's recent exchange of queens, while simplifying, has presented an opportunity to activate the rook on the c-file, aiming to contest control and potentially pressure white's isolated c4 pawn. Solidifying the queenside structure becomes paramount, preventing any potential pawn breaks from black's knights on d6 and f5, while simultaneously creating a safe haven for the rook on c1 should the c-file open up. Realigning the monarch from the center of activity towards a safer wing, this maneuver seeks to escape the immediate pressure and begin a subtle restructuring of black's defensive setup. Shifting the king's position away from the e-file's potential long-term exposure, this retreat signifies a proactive step in avoiding future tactical complications and preparing for the positional adjustments that may arise as the game progresses. This king's repositioning is a strategic pivot, subtly signaling a desire to avoid the central crossfire and instead establish a more secure anchoring point on the queenside, hinting at future defensive fortifications. Initiating a king's relocation towards the f-file, this move prioritizes king safety, drawing the monarch away from the center and potentially preparing to connect the rooks on the back rank. The king embarks on a journey from the e-file to the f-file, a crucial maneuver aimed at bolstering its security and setting the stage for a more consolidated defensive posture in the ensuing middle game. Liberating the c-file for its rooks, this maneuver initiates a structural pawn exchange that opens avenues and simplifies the board, preparing for a potential endgame battle where piece activity and pawn structure will be paramount. Opening the b-file grants immediate access to potential queenside pressure and a more active rook, though it does leave the pawn structure somewhat compromised with doubled pawns on the c-file. Opening the c-file aggressively contests central space and aims to exploit the potential weakness on black's queenside pawn structure after the exchange. Pushing the d-pawn now is a desperate attempt to liberate the kingside pawn structure and create some breathing room against white's encroaching forces, but it significantly weakens the dark squares and opens up the e-file for potential white exploitation. Unleashing a central pawn thrust, white cracks open the game and challenges black's cramped position. This bold advance aims to disrupt black's defensive setup, creating immediate tension and forcing a response. By pushing the e-pawn, white seeks to gain more space in the center and potentially open lines for their pieces. The move also puts pressure on black's d5 pawn, which is currently a key defensive piece. White might be looking to exploit any weaknesses that arise from black's attempt to maintain their central pawn structure. The pawn break could also lead to tactical skirmishes, and white clearly believes they are ready for them. This is a dynamic decision that injects a dose of aggression into the otherwise somewhat static position. Embracing a pawn chain with the e6 advance solidifies black's central structure and aims to restrict white's knight mobility on d5, while simultaneously preparing to develop the queenside bishop from its current passive square. Liberating the knight to *n4 aims to activate this piece on the queenside, potentially eyeing squares like c5 or b6 and disrupting black's pawn structure. This maneuver also opens up the c-file for white's rook, which could become significant later if the central pawns advance. It's a proactive approach to contest queenside space and create new attacking avenues. Opening up a new avenue for the rook on the queen's flank immediately increases its scope and potential influence over the central pawn structure, challenging white's knight and preparing for a potential infiltration on the b-file. Initiating an aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside, f4 aims to disrupt black's solid setup, potentially opening lines for white's pieces and creating attacking opportunities. Black aims to activate the rook by bringing it to the open c-file, potentially challenging white's control there and creating counterplay. Unleashing a pawn thrust to seize more territory and restrict black's bishop, this push fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a potential for a queenside bind while simultaneously opening avenues for white's remaining pawns to advance. Initiating a pawn storm on the kingside, black boldly challenges white's central control and attempts to create attacking chances. But this action also opens lines and potentially weakens their own king's shelter. Opening the c-file now offers a direct route for your rook to penetrate black's queenside defenses, creating immediate pressure on the pawn chain and potentially disrupting their coordination. The bishop's advance to capture the pawn on e5 injects immediate dynamic tension, challenging white's central pawn structure and potentially opening lines for black's remaining pieces. Focusing on the open file, bishop redeployment aims to exploit the d-file pressure and potentially support a future pawn push or piece insertion. Navigating the messy pawn structure, black aims to recentralize the king for activity, a crucial step given the open files and potential for white's rooks to penetrate. Securing the central king escape square and preparing to contest the open e-file demonstrates a clear intent to activate pieces and gain initiative. Seeking to exploit the now open diagonal towards white's king, the bishop surges forward, not just to deliver a check, but to potentially disrupt white's central pawn structure and establish a strong outpost if met with passive defense. Securing the king behind a newly fortified pawn wall creates a safe haven from the immediate threats, allowing for a more patient regrouping of pieces. The rook now ventures forward, seeking to contest the g-file and create active play, a logical follow-up to the king's repositioning. A strategic gambit is initiated, pushing the king's pawn forward to create a sanctuary on the kingside. This pawn thrust, h4, isn't just about expanding space. It's a prophylactic measure aimed at shielding the monarch from potential diagonal threats or future infiltration on the kingside. White is proactively building a defensive barrier, recognizing that with the queens off the board and the center locked, battles often devolve into pawn storms and maneuvering on the flanks. The pawn advance also subtly prepares for a potential g4 push, aiming to further restrict black's bishop and potentially open lines towards black's king if he chooses to castle there later. It's a quiet, positional maneuver that sets the stage for a long-term struggle for initiative, potentially leading to a queenside pawn race or a kingside attack. Unleashing a pawn to challenge the kingside space white has meticulously built, this move introduces immediate tension and demands a response, potentially opening lines for the black pieces if handled carelessly. Reclaiming the open d-file after black's determined push offers a crucial foothold for white's rooks to initiate central action, potentially disrupting black's rather passive pawn structure and preparing for a more active middle game engagement. Black reinforces the pawn chain on the queenside and prepares to bring the rook to a more active central file. Securing the rook on its new outpost on the third rank creates a formidable battery alongside the queen, aiming directly at black's potentially exposed king. Relocating the bishop to c7 allows it to support the d5 pawn and also prepares for potential activity on the b8-h2 diagonal if the rook ever clears the c-file. Unlocking the b-file for potential infiltration, white aims to disrupt black's rook's dominion over the open file and simultaneously prepare a pawn push on the queenside to gain space and restrict black's pieces. Actively defending that vulnerable queenside pawn with the rook sidesteps immediate tactical concerns, though it passively surrenders the c-file to white's looming control. Seizing the opened h-file immediately pressures black's king, creating a critical vulnerability that must be addressed before the pawn structure fully solidifies. Securing the king on the newly opened f-file, the black monarch strategically retreats from the immediate danger zone presented by white's pawn push and advances into a more sheltered central position, aiming to become an active participant in the coming skirmishes and prepare for a potential endgame transition where its presence will be paramount. Reclaiming the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to pressure the now somewhat exposed black king on the kingside. The king's journey to safety from the now opened kingside is a paramount concern. Finding a secure outpost for him is crucial before white's pieces can coordinate for a decisive attack. Re-establishing a knight on its natural diagonal after the pawn's sacrifice offers enhanced attacking potential, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside pawns and the exposed enemy king. Unlocking the d-file for the rooks and challenging white's central pawn structure, this audacious thrust opens up exciting possibilities for black's rooks and aims to destabilize white's pawn chain. Unlocking the queenside space by pushing the b-pawn allows the rook on c1 to potentially participate in attacking the king and creates crucial lines for piece mobility. Targeting the weaker pawn with the rook will try to create a passed pawn, but it sacrifices valuable time that could be spent consolidating the position. Unlocking the queenside with a knight hop to a more active square is the immediate goal, aiming to press the advantage of white's space. Initiating a sortie from the relative safety of the back rank, black's rook ventures towards the center, aiming to contest the open files and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. Activating the rook to contest the open f file is a logical step, aiming to disrupt black's potential kingside initiative and prepare for further central advances. Reactivating the rook on the f-file offers a breath of fresh air, aiming to disrupt white's solid pawn structure and potentially open lines towards the vulnerable king. Re-establishing knight activity and preparing to contest the now open g-file is the primary objective here, aiming to develop a coherent attack or at least prevent black from consolidating their central pawn push. Unlocking the central e-file offers immediate attacking prospects, forcing white's pieces to reevaluate their defensive setup. Asserting control over the crucial central diagonal, the bishop repositions to eye the black king's potentially exposed position, aiming to exploit any weaknesses that might arise from black's increasingly constricted pawn structure. Activating the rook on the fourth rank now creates a powerful battery with the bishop, eyeing the weak pawns on the queenside and potentially setting up a squeeze. Securing the king with a timely repositioning frees up the rook, to potentially contest the open file, aiming to disrupt black's newly established central pawn presence. Seeking a more active rook presence, black aims to bring their doubled rooks into more decisive action along the second rank, potentially preparing for a future attack on white's somewhat exposed king. Seizing the initiative, white snatches a pawn on the queen side, forcing black to react and potentially creating weaknesses in their pawn structure. Sacrificing material to disrupt the opponent's king's safety and launch a counterattack is a bold decision, aiming to exploit the open files and potentially create mating threats. Unlocking the g-file after the capture, white aims to exploit the exposed black king and potentially launch a decisive kingside assault, while simultaneously consolidating their own king's safety behind the pawn shield. Black's bishop recaptures, finally achieving a recapture and potentially stabilizing the pawn structure around the king. The immediate threat of the passed pawn on the g-file is removed, offering a moment of respite. However, white's bishop on a6 remains a persistent thorn, controlling key squares and limiting black's maneuvering options in the center. This exchange highlights the ongoing battle for central influence and pawn majority advantages, where even seemingly simple captures can have subtle, cascading positional consequences for the remainder of the game. Re-establishing the rook's presence on an open file is crucial, aiming to pressure black's vulnerable king or exploit the weakened queenside. Sacrificing the exchange to activate the rook and create immediate pressure on the weakened kingside. Kings repositioning to potentially shelter from any lingering threats along the third rank and assess the central pawn structure's stability now that black's e-pawn has advanced. Sacrificing the bishop offers a chance to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside, but it also exposes the black king to more pressure. Instantly shifting the rook to the d-file shores up the king's defense and prepares to contest that crucial open file, aiming to disrupt black's control and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses around the monarch. The bishop now occupies a more passive square, relinquishing control of the key dark squares that had been a thorn in white's side. Opening up lines for the rook by sacrificing a pawn. Unleashing the pawn to e3 finally cracks open the queenside blockade, aiming to pry open lines for the rooks and potentially disturb the white king's safety, even with the remaining pieces. Reclaiming the open file with the rook offers a vital defensive pivot, solidifying the pawn structure and preparing for potential advances that could restrict black's active pieces. A desperate check, aiming to disrupt white's beautifully coordinated pieces and perhaps force a draw by perpetual check, although the king looks quite safe behind its pawns. The sudden capture opens up the king's defenses, presenting a stark choice between defending the remaining pawns or solidifying the monarch's safety, a pivotal moment where vigilance must be paramount. The unexpected promotion of a pawn, once tucked away on the 7th rank, now surges forward to become a queen, dramatically altering the material balance and injecting a surprising twist into an otherwise tense endgame. Sacrificing the pawn is a bold gamble to unlock the kingside majority, hoping to create an unstoppable passed pawn while black's king remains exposed. Suddenly, the queens are gone, and this pawn's march to promotion, after sacrificing itself for a passed pawn on the f-file, creates immediate attacking potential. The king, now liberated from its protective pawn shield, becomes an active participant in the endgame, a pivotal shift in the game's dynamic. The promotion of the pawn creates a new queen, dramatically altering the board's complexion and ushering in a decisive endgame phase where the immediate threat of the new queen must be neutralized by developing the bishop to a defensive stance, allowing it to monitor key squares and prevent further immediate incursions while white's king is still somewhat exposed on the kingside.